recording, and then
Okay, we're starting to
we
record.
can start. Yeah. So welcome back to this.
Be careful what you say.
Sorry. Oh.
Be careful what you say then.
Welcome back to this, the 9th session of the Essence of History seminar series. It gives me great pleasure this week to introduce Robert Scharff, who is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of New Hampshire. Professor Scharff's research include contemporary European philosophy, particularly Heidegger, Gadamer, and hermeneutics, philosophy of technology, the 19th century philosophy, including Comte, Mill, Dilthey, and the history of positivism, and philosophies of history and the human sciences. He is the author of numerous monographs exploring these themes, including Comte After Positivism in 1995, How History Matters to Philosophy, Reconsidering Philosophy's Past After Positivism in 2014, and Heidegger Becoming Phenomenological, Interpreting Husserl Through Dilthey 1916 to 1925, published in 2019. When I approached Robert about presenting a paper for the series, he was somewhat skeptical about the theme, about whether there could be an essence of history. And a few months later, when he sent me his title, I was pleased to see that his skepticism had not budged an inch. So it's a privilege now for me to introduce Professor Robert Scharff for his paper, If History Had an Essence, It Wouldn't Be History. Bob.
Yeah, it's more than skepticism, sorry. Hi, everybody. Just a quick apology. There was supposed to be an outline on your screen of the main themes of this paper as I move through them. And it's somewhere out in cyberspace, but I can't find it. So you're going to see me reading a paper, for which I apologize. In this paper, I want to explain why my title is correct, but only because it is presented in a world that is likely to misunderstand its point. Aaron was quite right in his original draft of our seminar's topic. If philosophical questions about the essence of history and about being historical are to be reposed in a serious way, they will have to be removed from the contemporary philosophy of history's epistemological concerns for truth, causality, and knowledge. Some of you will start to notice that my concern here echoes Heidegger's argument in Being and Time, that one cannot properly understand what it is to be historical if one's inquiry is based on a concept of history derived from the historian's practice. In this paper, however, I approach the matter not through Heidegger's texts, but by arguing that the very idea of a philosophical removal or reposing is a problem. On the one hand, there is no doubt that epistemology has been widely given philosophical priority since Descartes. Like it or not, this inherited aspect of Cartesianism still tends to govern the atmosphere in which most Western philosophy begins, and thus also the atmosphere in which any reposings or removals of its powerful presence will also begin. Any new effort at a philosophy of history will be born into a world that expects to hear first about the nature of historical inquiry, its methods, its theories, and its means of confirming claims. The strong implication is that non-epistemological or extra-scientific interests are best considered only after setting the ground rules for any inquiry. Yet on the other hand, the very continuance of this atmosphere is something of a puzzle. Much of the Cartesian legacy has been rejected. No one takes Descartes' actual theories seriously anymore, and his ahistorical and mathematical-minded model of philosophical method has been thoroughly reinterpreted. Today, all of us are at least post-positivists, if not postmodernists. Yet the old Cartesian dualisms, epistemology versus metaphysics, analytic versus speculative philosophy, causal explanation versus historical understanding, are all still there, given to us along with a generally naturalistic ontological sense of what there really is and what to do with it. Cartesianism in this sense is not part of our knowable past, like a theoretical system or ideology that we might justifiably say we come after. It lingers in the air as an inherited and pre-established philosophical sense of things that urges us in a powerful way to favor an epistemological orientation in philosophy, one that not only identifies real philosophers, their topics, and how we should approach them, but simultaneously puts philosophers who refuse to be real philosophers in a defensive position. As with every other topic then, regarding history, it seems that we have arrived at our present situation already dominated by an orthodoxy equipped with some weaponized PR. In the past few decades, this state of affairs has provoked a massive critical literature. Scientific inquiry, its methods, and its means of confirmation have all been pluralized, contextualized, and fitted out with all sorts of softer ideas of epistemic rigor, cognitive clarity, and justifies belief. But my interest here is not in these revisions. It is in the less considered question of who does the revising. Out of what sense of being a philosopher do these revisions get made? What sense of philosophy's task motivates the idea that such revisions are even needed? And is this motivation any less epistemological than the traditional default position? There is a very long story to be told here, but I must settle for discussing one well-known episode from the continental tradition. For reasons that will become clear in a moment, I consider an old example, in this case, the famous Habermas-Gadamer debate over how to interpret life-world experience. Gadamer, we know, defends the idea of a philosophical hermeneutics that is both universal in scope and yet entirely grounded in life-world language and practice. But Habermas objects to such a philosophy that it abandons any hope of knowing the truth of this world. He argues that only by taking a conscious and cognitive distance from daily life can one gain the required perspective from which to diagnose and analyze the systematic distortions and pseudo-communication endemic to it. Of course, Habermas, the neo-Kantian, is on full display here. He is extending the epistemic imagery of physical science to a critical philosophy that treats the human world the same way that physics treats nature. For him, life-world experience is to sense perception what critical social theory of cultural practice is to naturalistic explanation of material movement. In both cases, objective researchers, having escaped from the perceptual inadequacies and common pathologies of ordinary life, are always in a better position to know reality than any historically bound consciousness of our ordinary experiences of life and nature. But why bother with any of this today? The very idea of science over which Gadamer and Habermas argue seems to be the outdated ahistorical conception of knowledge gathering that dominated the middle decades of the 20th century. But this question, I think, is misdirected. What remains philosophically important is not the terms of this old debate itself, but the question of what two sorts of philosophers are debating it. Out of what understanding of being a philosopher do they think? Gadamer's objection to Habermas is ultimately not about his substantive claims, although he certainly does object to Habermas's idea of critical social theory as a kind of analog to psychoanalysis. But the real problem is how Habermas philosophizes. For Gadamer, the hermeneut, to come to life already sure that you are methodologically free of its alleged pathology renders you incapable of understanding how it is with life simply as we actually live it. To the extent that social scientists continue to display Habermasian confidence in their power to theoretically override whatever life discovers for itself, the debate settled nothing. This is why, says Gadamer, it remains, quote, the central question of the modern age to determine how our actual life experience is related to the unassailable and anonymous authority that confronts us in the claims of science. Yet Gadamer's position is not as hermeneutical as he intends it to be. He says he wants to reconnect the objective world of science and technology with, quote, those fundamental orders of our being that are neither arbitrary nor manipulable, but simply demand our respect. Yet to see philosophy's task this way, that is, with the objective world laid out before us as one thing, and the world of actual life experience as another, is also to depict the kind of thinker who considers their reconnection as just as much an outsider to these two topics as the natural scientist is to nature. If there we are, facing two object domains, then every response will remain beholden to the idea that science is not part of the life world. And today, of course, this really means that science better not be part of the life world, or we will never know its truth. In short, philosophy is everywhere still cultivating a self-image inspired by Descartes' tree of knowledge. Philosophy tends the epistemological and metaphysical soil in which science is rooted. Science, the tree's substantial trunk, produces knowledge, and this knowledge bears fruit in the branches of applied science, especially medicine, engineering, and eventually morals. The purpose of Descartes' meditation, then, is to set the proper distance from life for scientific and technological thought, and for the philosophy that shows them the way. Fast forward, and we come to today's enthusiasts for STEM education, who push a curriculum centered on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but remain silent, if not dismissive, about humanities courses where, but only if there's time and money, one might occasionally consider interesting topics like the experience of being historical or whether history has an essence. Of course, no historian can accept my description. It is thin and hyperbolic, linking old texts with current affairs by gesture and not evidence. Yet it does seem clear that there are ruling images here, old images of knowledge and experience that continue to shape our deep cultural sense of how we find ourselves ontologically speaking, even if its dominant mood has shifted dramatically away from the 19th century optimism and toward criticism and suspicion. But listen to the moves that are being made as a result. We now want to deprive scientific knowledge of its ahistorical idea of objectivity. We want to return resolutely toward human concerns not fully disclosed by scientific accounts, and we reject the positivism that fails to appreciate the necessity of these moves. The phrases I stress evoke the old Cartesian imagery of context-free choice. As Descartes explains in Meditation 4, to be a real philosopher is to bring ideas before one's methodologically trained mind, evaluate their fitness, and then affirm or reject them. Truth resides in these judgments, which are the product of a will that is just as context-free as the mind that entertains what is to be judged. In the end, then, not only Habermas's objectivistic taking a distance from life, but also Gadamer's hermeneutically generous but survey-like juxtaposition of authoritative science and the rest of existence still echo Descartes' idea of detached minds and pure wills. In fact, from this angle, their conceptions of distance and reconnection seem in a certain way to make them even more radically Cartesian than Descartes himself. Descartes himself would have been appalled to see his carefully disciplined, rule-governed epistemology for the sciences recast in such an unrestrained and decontextualized way. It is true that when he sits down to write the Meditations, he resolves to turn away from whatever is available to his senses and to let a mathematically fashioned sense of cognition guide his work. Yet he emphatically does not understand his foundational analysis of scientific notion to be a proper model for philosophical inquiry across all topics. Contrary to the picture that one might get by reading only the Meditations, Descartes does not just start in theoretical midair, posit a metaphysical dualism of mental and physical substance, and then proceed to sweep all other approaches to life experience away using his method as the broom. As he explains in the discourse, His epistemology has an existential origin. In living through the first wave of reactions to Descartes, he realized that the promising new science needed a founding procedure that could, as in mathematics, achieve universal agreement without threatening religious faith. For Descartes, then, being historical matters first. His four rules are the manifestation of a particular life concern, a methodological response to his Galilean-inspired interest in legitimating natural science in a culturally and theologically conflicted space. He never flings these rules across all of life for the sake of a philosophy of everything. He knows perfectly well, for example, that something much more experientially intimate is going on when we ask about the good life than when we observe external objects and make predictions about their movement. And he recognizes that moral concerns can't function according to any doubt-busting instructions. If I try to pursue the ethical life the same way I do mathematics and physics, he says, I would never be sure enough of anything to act at all. And he adds, whatever the certainty of faith is, it is obviously not like logical certainty. He tells us that he is therefore setting ethics and theology aside for a while in order to question his beliefs about nature and how to know it. It is specifically these beliefs, and not all his beliefs, that he goes on to analyze in a mathematicized way. Of course, my point here is not really about Descartes, it is about his progeny. Down to the present day, modern philosophers still tend to follow his lead, but only after turning him into a Cartesian, that is, someone who judges absolutely everything in the same objective and universalizing spirit. And it has proved very difficult to get out from under this outlook because it comes with its own self-serving interpretation. Do you want the power, clarity, and promise of universal, rationally agreed upon knowledge? Or do you want radical relativism and subjectivity? Descartes' autobiographical remarks, however, tell a different story. They remind us that his idea of an ahistorical mind waging war against the messiness and naivete of life is linked to only one specific experience-based concern, namely acquiring reliable and usable knowledge of nature. In other words, there really is a view from nowhere, it's just not from nowhere. Achieving objectivity is not a glorious emancipation from the confusions and perspectival finitude of ordinary life. It is actually a way of being historical, an especially rigorous and cognitively selective way of interpreting relations with our surroundings. It constitutes, as Heidegger says, a mode of existence called knowing the world. But before this knowing gets conceived as a rule-governed practice, it is already a way of existing, an understanding of things that has become both technically powerful and culturally dominant, but not ontologically basic. This is a truth about human life, however, that many philosophers are not prepared to acknowledge, namely that scientific practice, when described within life itself, remains the proper conceptual line of articulation for only one of life's concerns. Even Husserl, while aspiring to be a phenomenologist, still summons the full authority of the modern tradition in order to argue that, quote, remaining immersed in the historical, forcing oneself to work within it, and yet still wanting to attain philosophical science is hopeless. Philosophy must not proceed from what others have said, but from things and from the problems that connected with them. And above all, it must not rest until it has attained its own absolutely clear beginnings. This attitude says everything about how not to think freshly about the central questions of this seminar. To imagine that we must force ourselves to remain immersed in the historical, one must first presume to occupy a place outside of it. With this, all hope of understanding our historicity, including the historicity of alleged ahistorical thinkers, disappears. And it can seem as if the only alternative to being Enlightenment modern is to be postmodern, to glory in the irreducible variety of all philosophical theories and systems, and to embrace the radical relativism that comes with it. Yet in fact, both options are just artifacts of the same Cartesian outlook. Whatever their intentions, even philosophers who would reject absolute standpoints and instead decide for radical relativity are behaving like inverted Cartesian subjects. Seen in this light, Gadamer's attempt to give the life world its due appears as a kind of way station. He certainly intends to treat all human existence hermeneutically, that is, from within our historically determinate living through of it. He recognizes that causally explaining nature is a mode of social practice, and that philosophy must be more than its theoretical expositor. Yet Gadamer, the reconnector of science and life, is not speaking hermeneutically. By juxtaposing science and life in theory-like fashion, he silently gives back to science its allegedly unassailable status, and ordinary experience automatically becomes something non-scientific, something lesser, that can at best be brought into relation with what is already more authoritative. Even so, Gadamer's failure to do what he intends should be a source of better interpretation, not just something to criticize. In fact, it is all the more instructive if we analyze how he fails. He understands that science involves a way of thinking that cannot be extended to the whole of life. But in going on to depict life as another thing placed beside science, he shows us what the next step is, namely, to reconsider who a philosopher must be to actually fulfill Gadamer's experience-based intentions. On this issue, Dilthey already shows a way forward. Gadamer misses this because he interprets Dilthey's lifelong efforts to defend a separate method for human science as proof that he remains squarely within the epistemological tradition. But Dilthey is in fact never satisfied with a purely epistemological approach to anything. His reason is simple, but its philosophical implications are not. In natural science, he argues, historically determinate relations with our surroundings are only disclosed through technically aided perception. Anticipation of the future must be understood as predicting, and knowing is defined as causally explaining. Given these restrictions, its procedures and results are best expressed primarily in the language that exemplifies only one of three kinds of conceptualization that Dilthey calls manifestations of life. In this case, the one that consists of concepts, judgments, and larger theoretical systems whose defining feature is their abstractness from life. They are, he says, detached from lived experience in which they arose and adapted to logical norms in order to ensure that they assert the validity of what is thought in a form that remains the same in every context, so that their meaning is the same for the one who formulates it as the one who understands it. In other words, for observation reports and predictive theories to be observation reports and predictive theories, they must be interpreted in the direction of their use, not in the direction of their genesis. They are, one might say, like the great Oz. They do their best work when one ignores what's behind the curtain. That is, refrains, as Dilthey puts it, from disclosing how their logical content is related to the dark background and fullness of the psychic historical life out of which they develop. But to be clear, none of this is criticism. Dilthey is just describing the necessity of the relation between the self-imposed restrictions of natural scientific thinking and its language and the effectiveness of its theories. It is a very powerful set of restrictions indeed, involving a deliberate epistemic commitment of disinterest toward any disclosure of our experience that is not filtered through its requirements. And that is just the point. Scientific practice requires being related to things in a selectively interested way. Granted then that an observational outlook, the quantification of findings, and a focus on prediction are rightly stressed, and if one wishes to explain natural phenomena. But precisely for this reason, they are inappropriate guidelines if one is concerned instead to understand the total relatedness of historical reality as it is possessed in experience. Those who explain nature can know nothing of this possibility. All they can allow themselves to say about experience is that it happens inside material bodies whose behavior we can observe. Of course, human beings can just be observed so that predictive theories can be generated about their behavior. But human beings and their creations can also be encountered and understood. Hence, we are understandable as both natural and historical beings. Historical science does therefore not offer another way to look at the same reality. It is the right way to engage with another reality. To explain is to cognize something as part of nature. To understand is to interpret something as part of historical life. But here the root philosophical problem arises. From what orientation could one possibly justify Dilthey's claim that both natural and psychic historical entities genuinely are, but in irreducibly different ways? The solution is to notice that, considered from within life itself, the natural and human sciences first appear not as different regions marked off with different methods, but as equally manifestations of a life concern. The one, an urge to know enough about our surroundings to make them predictable. The other, a desire to directly interpret the lived experience of human beings and their productions. Explaining and interpreting, then, are not only require different methods, they must be conducted by different kinds of researchers. To explain or interpret, one needs to be attuned to and open to disclosures of the natural or the historical. In order for a science to engage in its rule-governed research, it will already have to be the practice of someone who ontologically understands what sort of subject matter they're studying. A close relationship between interpretive human science and hermeneutical philosophy is implied here, but there is also a crucial difference. Hermeneutical scientists think from life's own standpoint for the sake of the specific task of systematically collecting knowledge of human existence. But philosophers who think from this same standpoint have to be open still further to the possibility of describing the totality of our engaged involvements as they articulate life's various concerns in systematic ways, and also to do so without playing epistemic or ontological favorites or limiting their reach to practices that search for knowledge. In short, a hermeneutic philosophy cannot model its task after one single practice, but must find a way to remain open to interpreting any manifestation of life in its own terms. In one way, however, this account is still too abstract. It does indicate a possible way for philosophy to interpret human practices in their own terms and not through their theories, methods, and observed behavior. But under what conditions are we ourselves likely to understand this possibility? In one respect, Husserl is right. No philosophy should just start thinking on the basis of what others have said. Yet it does not follow that we should seek some sort of self-possessed beginning instead. From his transcendental position, Husserl speaks about being immersed in a domain called history, as if not being historical were a better choice than remaining in it. But his account can still seem powerfully right, precisely because of its Cartesian pedigree. So today, if we just start asking about being historical and about history's essence, without a reflective awareness of how we are inheriting this possibility of asking such questions, we are likely to do the same. We will be inclined to think of history as a place in which human beings are located, and to represent this situation either empirically or in metaphysical one-offs, that is, with finalizing conceptions of what history really is and further conceptions of what it is like to be placed there. Indeed, the whole traditional point has always been to fix the reality of history and historical beings, if not metaphysically and as a whole, then empirically and little by little. But Dilthey shows us another possibility. As regards being historical, instead of thinking of this as a property of a representable object of empirical research or metaphysical theory, it can be interpreted as a perfectly understandable feature of the way we live through our circumstances, that is, of how we exist and not of what we are, a feature that is partially apparent in explicit traditions, but also alive in us in a deeper sort of inheritance of global meaningfulness that pre-understands how everything really is and what's expected of us. Thus, this, for example, is what I think Nietzsche means when he describes himself as arriving in the present as having been, in a way that is at once burdensome and enabling. That is being historical, disclosed hermeneutically. It is with this sense of enabling burdensomeness of inheritance in mind that hermeneutical philosophers need to understand their own orientation. And I think it can help to also interpret other philosophers the same way, especially those whose inheritance seems resonant with our own present concerns. I have argued elsewhere, for example, that we ought to read Auguste Comte this way. His so-called three-stage law of Western intellectual and social development is now mostly dismissed in the usual Cartesian fashion as either a discredited empirical theory or as part of a speculative global narrative. But these interpretations ignore the fact that for Comte himself, the law serves first and foremost as an articulation of his own sense of being a 19th century thinker in emergent scientific times. As he sees it, he is inheriting a tradition that has gone through theological and metaphysical periods and is now fulfilling itself in the sciences and their applications. Of course, his words can be read as adding up to a failed empirical or essentialist theory. But we might better understand Comte in his own terms and notice that for him, the law is a kind of reflected projection from within his situation and expressive of his basic sense of what possibilities are opening up and coming to be experienced in an increasingly post-theological and post-metaphysical way. When seen in this light, Comte's idea of the third or scientific stage of history depicts a way for us to be, and it is then hard to miss its contemporary relevance. Regarding what it means to exist in an increasingly techno-scientific world, his view is by no means as dated as its empirical details and imperial tone can make it sound. Indeed, Comte's anthem to techno-scientific life, his portrayal of our last and most mature condition, describes quite well the current background understanding of most Western technocrats and transhumanists, as well as many analytic philosophers of science and technology. But what should be especially provocative for us is that Comte never asks whether there could be a fourth stage. Reading him now, when an era that he could only see as emerging seems to have arrived, our experience leaves us less convinced that our future lies in more of the same under optimized conditions. Today, his optimistic hopes for techno-scientific life can often sound hollow. And here I return to my title. If one asks about being historical and about history's essential meaning in the usual way, one gets mostly bad phenomenology and metaphysical speculation, and so it would be with Comte. Yet to dismiss him from this epistemological angle means we learn nothing, and at the same time tend to reinforce and the additional and equally Cartesian tendency to turn all questions of how to live into engineering problems, where one applies knowledge to a waiting environment manipulates everything in new and ever more satisfying ways, and continues to depict us humans as still in charge, only now with a consciousness that is a little more sensitive to context's empirical variety and hidden dangers. A hermeneutic take on what Comte says, however, can do better. By interpreting it as expressive of his life experience and not as a theory he imposes on it, we can feel its resonance with our own inherited sense of living in a techno-scientific world. And if we then read Heidegger's idea of Western philosophy's ending in technoscience in the same spirit, these two manifestations of life fit nicely together, both in what they share and in how they differ. Comte could remain focused on how he is living through his times with no consideration of a possibility of a post-scientific stage. He could not, like Heidegger, speak of a possibility of overcoming something that had not yet arrived. With 19th century eyes, Comte happily concludes that a scientific view of the world is the only plausible position for enlightened minds to take. At the same time, Comte's characterization of an emerging way of being in the world comes pretty close to identifying what is now the dominant inheritance-based conception of our so-called developed world. And here, if Heidegger's refusal to think of our current situation in Comte's optimistic terms is read as an experience-based articulation of current scientific life, the two accounts together give us an illuminating picture of how Comte's happy pragmatic projection has, in its subsequent realization, developed a Janus face. That is, on the one hand, as world changing in its positive transformations of our situation beyond Comte's wildest dreams, but on the other hand, as deeply distressing and an ultimately dangerous global setup. Taken together, we might say, there we are, burdened inheritors of an already positivistically understood world, who are nevertheless enabled by it in a way that permits us both to praise its ubiquitous positive results and lament its equally ubiquitous presence as the hegemonic framing of everything and anything, and yet somehow in its eventuation also open to the possibility, as Heidegger puts it, of preparing a free relation to the techno-scientific imperative that since Comte's day has more fully arrived. It is true that Comte and Heidegger are both talking here about something that they think is essential to their age, but interpreted from the standpoint of life, instead of from the objectivist perspective of modern epistemology, one sees that they both understand essence existentially and verbally, not theoretically and substantively. That is, as indicating the primary ontological enabling feature of an existentially meaningful world space. Neither of their conceptions of essence is part of any metaphysical system, nor are they universals identifying the static and unchanging features of every age, or even our age. The difference between their conceptions is not theoretical, but experiential. Today, generalizing expressions of dissatisfaction with techno-scientific existence arrive from a world already understood in Comtean terms, but one whose experiential center has shifted. The enframing character of techne now gives us the ontological atmosphere of our lives in a manner so thorough that its predominance is hard even to recognize. But as experienced, it can come to be recognized, understood, interpreted, and enacted as the strong default ontology of our times, but not a causal necessity. That is, as something dangerous, but hinting at a redemption. In the 1840s, it was a matter of asking how a genuinely techno-scientific life might more freely emerge from a still predominantly theological and metaphysical atmosphere. Now it is a question, as Heidegger puts it, of asking whether and how the world civilization is now beginning might one day overcome its technological, scientific, industrial character as the sole criterion of our journey through the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob, sorry, for your excellent paper. I'll open the floor now to questions. I might jump in first before, yeah, hands are going up. I'm going to jump in first.
You get to go first.
I get to go first. I just wondered if you could possibly expand a bit more on Heidegger and whether you'd bring Blumenberg perhaps into the mix, because Blumenberg seemed to, I'm not sure about Comte, I'm not actually familiar with Comte, but Blumenberg had quite a positive understanding of modernity and theoretical curiosity. And you'd imagine that Heidegger would argue against that quite severely, because, you know, it could be argued that the supposed turn of Heidegger is a turn towards a philosophy of history, but it's also a turn towards a philosophy of freedom. Human authenticity turns into dwelling poetically, which, you know, and he traces potentially that back to Anaximander. So I just wonder, well, firstly, could you expand on that point on Heidegger, and then does Blumenberg fit into that at all in a positive light in the Comte sense?
Yeah, Heidegger's reaction to that is going to be twofold. To the extent that everything Blumenberg says is a resonant description of how it is to live through life, it says something important and hermeneutical. To the extent that he says it in a theoretical way, as if it were something that life simply has to be, he's going to object to it.
Yeah.
The way he would object to any view that is said from on high. So, for example, his notion of freedom is Cartesian. It's abstract. It's going to be, first we get the sociological knowledge we need of how things really are, and then we're going to apply it. Now, that's not to say there aren't times to do that. You know, that's what I want the engineer that's building a new bridge near me to do to get me back to Portsmouth, right? I want him to do exactly that and nothing else. And I want him to do it coldly and with detachment and with no thought of how it's going to affect his life, right? Because I want to trust it, right? Just like I want, you know, my surgeon, when, you know, I don't want him to look at me as an aesthetic object. I want him to apply his medical knowledge and fix me, right? So to the extent that Blumenberg is talking about the sorts of activities where we need that kind of theorizing, fine. To the extent that he turns it into the philosophy of how the present age is, that's the old modern problem, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Right? And of course, it's even more frustrating. It is followed then by postmodern reactions to it that emphasize all the things it can't cover in the same theoretical way. I don't know if that helps, but that's
that answers it perfectly. Thank you, Lawrence.
Yeah, Bob, thank you very much for your paper, which I just wanted how much I enjoyed it. I was fascinated by your during your paper the kind of the temporal determinations that come up. I mean, you almost characterize Comte as one who comes, as it were, from the past up into the present. And I don't know the Nietzsche quote that you gave, but I'm assuming arriving in the present as having been is als Gewesener, as I'm assuming it isn't ein Gewesener, but it could be, as it were, as a one having been. Yeah, I'm not sure, but and the question that that I want to turn to is, because I don't think, I mean, Aaron and I struggle over this. You know, he still believes in a later Heidegger. I don't actually. I spent most of my life trying to dismantle the notion of a later Heidegger, not because I don't think, and not because there aren't changes, there patently are, but because I think the questions are the same. And the question of the transcendence, of the unifying, of what constitutes the unifying, that lets us come in from non-being into the unifying character of presence. I mean, to give an example of this, I was just going through the latest volume of the Gesamtausgabe fell through my letterbox because I subscribed to it, and it's in the late 60s. Heidegger's writing about a book, Oscar Becker's book, Dasein und Dawesen. And he says, and this is my scratch translation, he says, you know, once again, Oscar Becker doesn't get it right. He will insist on seeing the Da not as a clearing, as it is in being and time, but rather he sees the Da of Dasein and Dawesen, and then the exact quote is, in the traditional sense, as location. In other words, that there are places that history sort of links up. And I've always wondered what Heidegger means by the historical as such, because it's not something he ever really clarifies. I mean, he clarifies it by gesturing towards people, by gesturing towards the Dilthey-York correspondence and so on. But there, I think you have it as something which constitutes the possibility of our recording the past from having been unified together in a present that comes to us from out of the future. And I just wondered if you'd comment on that, because it bugs me and I haven't solved it yet. And I wondered if you had a solution.
Yeah, well, I didn't. Boy, how many Gesamtausgabe volumes do you want me to refer to? I think that I take seriously what he says in the second division of Being and Time about happening in a historical way is simply concrete temporalizing. And that's the way being in the world has to be understood. That's the way our existence has to be understood. The problem in Being in Time is that it's understood from as if it were from our point of view. And that makes it difficult then to talk about the eventuation of being. So there has to be this shift that everybody calls the return, the turn. There has to be this way of rethinking the situation that he describes by the end of the published version of Being in Time in such a way that it gives priority to what he asks about instead of the condition under which he's asking, right? So that change has to take place. But down to the last works, I think he tries to think from out of a sense of being in the world as historicizing, as happening in a historical way. That's what Gesehen literally means. It means happening in a historical way. So I don't know why it can't be translated that way. It's a mysterious historicizing and these various other locutions. Now, if you take that seriously, then this is a way you can understand other philosophers as well. That's what I did with Comte. That's where I got the idea to do it. It seemed to me that if you really read what he says about the third stage, he's talking about the way he understands himself to be living through the time he's living in, right? And that's not something static. That's not something over and done with. He has huge quarrels with Mill about this. Mill thinks that the third stage law, it's not so much wrong as it is no longer necessary to think about because we're already here in the third stage. And Cole says, no, we're not here yet. We're coming to it, right? That sense of temporalizing runs all the way through the things he says about what's going on around him, including the fact that he ends up refusing to add a final level after the development of social science called the science of ethics, as if it were an engineering problem to put together everything we've known so that we can now live properly. And he says, no, it's not like that. The only kind of synthesis you can get with all the things we've learned about how we live is it's a subjective synthesis. It's a synthesis from within, right? That has got to be more responsive to the way things are changing than to any sort of principle that you could impose on it. That's the old metaphysical way. We got to stay away from it. Now, what kind of a person can say all of that? It has to be somebody who is temporalizing in a historical way and not thinking in accordance with now time, where you look at the situation that you've got and impose an idea on it. And that's the other way of thinking about history that you have to think of later after you've understood that to be one possible way of happening in a historical way. Comte makes this nice crack about this that I like I think, covers pretty much this territory. He says, look, I've got no objection to scientific theorizing. In fact, I think it should happen as quickly as possible with as little experimenting as necessary, okay, provided that we don't take those theories so seriously that we forget where they came from, namely life, right? That leaves them continually in the process of, if you want, essencing, of changing what they think is essential on the basis of further living. Now, this living, of course, for scientists, has become something that is very selectively rigorous. Okay, there are a lot of ways in which our living through life can't matter if you're going to observe carefully and make predictions on the basis of data. Is that addressing what you're asking?
Yeah, I think so.
Your reference
I mean,
to transcendence leaves me cold. I really don't know what to do with it.
I don't, well, he's careful to put it in the verbal form, transcendens rather than transcendent. So, I mean,
okay, I did mishear you. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, in other words, that it is in the transcendens, the going on transcending, is the historicizing, as it were. And I think,
okay.
I mean,
okay. I don't like the word because of its history, if you want. Right?
No, and he draws direct attention to that when he discusses it. I mean, he very often, you know, in the lecture courses, he'll say to students, and this has nothing to do with theology, or this has nothing to do with God, as it were.
Right.
But he has in mind, of course, the first critique, and he has in mind his own quarrel, as it were, with what his own quarrel with what Kant both delivers and fails to deliver. In other words, the happening character of being, but not the projecting character of being. We are being realized. We are not doing the realizing, as it were, which is I took to be your attack on subjectivity all the way through.
Exactly.
And I think it was only that I'm trying to draw attention to, that being realized, which, you know, that strange sentence he has later on when he says, strange as it may seem, fremd wie es klingt, the notion of temporalizing in being and time is the same as what is meant by logos. And that's an extraordinary statement, but given the later, you know, the later discussion around Heraclitus and logos, it does make sense. But anyway, I'm probably there are other hands up, so I should. But thank you. Yeah.
Turn
Luke.
yourself on. Hi, Luke.
Am I audible?
You are.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. That, I mean, you speak to all my prejudices in a way, and I think I am. I'm basically on board with all this, but I just wonder if one couldn't sort of sharpen things up on a few points. For instance, might it be helpful to distinguish a bit more firmly between science and technology in all this, which is a distinction I don't think Heidegger always makes as firmly as he could, and also that Descartes doesn't make as firmly as he could. I mean, I think in one way, okay, you're right, Descartes is not a Cartesian in the sense in which you describe, but in another sense, I think Descartes is still very similar to us moderns in that if you look at Descartes' motivations for being interested in science, they're not scientific. And one of the things he thinks of science as of interest primarily because of what it can do to improve the human condition. And this has always been, at least since the early modern period, the main motivation for so-called scientific pursuits, really the development of technology. People are not interested in understanding the workings of the natural world simply as such for the sake of it, which is what science, if you like, in its pure form is about. So when it comes to talking about the nature of the real, and you said, at one point, this is what science was interested in. I actually don't think that's a scientific view either. If you look at any scientific formula, there's nothing in there about reality. E equals mc squared, F equals mv. You take any scientific equation you like, it says nothing about the real. It just says, here are some constants, here are some variables, here's a relationship between them. there's nothing there about reality. The idea that this somehow constitutes reality is, I think, as you're saying, a philosophical prejudice or a common sense prejudice. But nothing actually in science itself has anything to say about the real, or what the world consists in, or how it works. So we can really firmly separate scientific understanding as a purely genuinely theoretical enterprise from the life world and from technology. And I think it's very important that we do that if we're going to sort of liberate ourselves from, you know, what Heidegger is talking about in terms of hegemonic end framing and the kinds of stuff that you're concerned about as well. But, you know, there's no problem with the pure physicist who just wants to smash some atoms together and figure out, you know, how the fundamental material stuff of reality works. The problem is when, you know, instead of having the thought that, well, if I smash this atom, there'll be a big release of energy, you think, ooh, I could make a bomb with that. And that's a completely different kind of thought. You know, it occupies an utterly different category of understanding, if you like. And so, in a sense, a firmer distinction between science and technology might help to develop your argument. That's one point. And the other point I had was on the nature of essence, where I thought you might go the Hegelian route here, where essence is the second moment of the logic. And as usual with Hegel, you get this ironic stance where essence turns out to be something that deconstructs itself. Essence only makes sense in relation to what's inessential. Essence can never get away from what it isn't. And so this thing which is supposed to be so fundamental turns out to be dependent on all these other criteria of exclusion and ends up deconstructing itself into the subject-object relationship, which is the stage of the notion, which is the third stage. And of course, subject and object are always correlative here, which is the stance you get in the phenomenology. And so what you end up with is just a series of different expressions of the subject-object relationship. And the person I think is good on this is, you mentioned Cohen, but I would say Ernst Cassirer is really helpful here, because what you get in Cassirer is a determinate number of standpoints. You get a scientific view, you get the life world, you get the historical view, but you don't get the postmodern splintering into infinitely many standpoints. You get a very limited account of, well, look, these are the main different ways of looking at things. So the postmodern confusion is between the fact that there are as many standpoints in a way as there are subjectivities, because we're all in a different spatio-temporal position, but there aren't very many kinds of subjectivities. We all do occupy our own individual sort of viewpoint on the world, but in terms of the ways we're looking at the world, there are really very, very few of those. There's science, there's history, there's common sense, or the life world, there's maybe art, perhaps maths, but, you know, there's really a limited number of these perspectives. And when you sort that out, as Cassirer seems to do, and you introduce a sort of firm distinction between science and the life world, it seems to me you have some useful distinctions which would just further support what you're trying to do, based also, I think, on Hegel's account of essence. So what you end up with, and where I thought you might go with this, is history is the essence of history is to be the becoming that is no essence. The essence of history is precisely to be just the change. We are what we've become. That's the essence. And I don't know if that's what you're actually trying to say, rephrased, or you've got something slightly different in mind. You're shaking your head, so now I'm going to let you tell me where you think this kind of misses what you're doing.
Yeah, I want to try to respond to what it seems to me are the two main themes you're raising. One is your alternative description of essencing, if you want. Notice that its movement is described logically in terms of the implications of the ideas. Okay, that's precisely what I don't want. Okay, what I want is to understand the movement of essencing in terms of the way experience keeps feeding however we think about it, in a way that forces us to change the way we think about it. Okay, that's, I mean, that goes all the way back. I actually learned this from non-Heideggerian sources, from Socrates and Comte. From Socrates, insofar as every dialogue gives them a slightly different sense of what justice is. Okay, but it's never platonically achieved, right? It's whatever the cumulative effect of his having lived through life so far tells him it is. And if he were to be articulate about that, that's what he would try to do. He tries not to say what justice is, precisely because then you become Hegel. Then a moving idea becomes moving only in terms of the logic of its further implications and not in terms of further life. Okay, so I really want to stay away from that way of thinking about things, but I also want to get back to the distinction between science and technology. In my other life, I'm a philosopher of technology. And you probably know that especially in Europe, there is a quarrel over whether or not to use the word technoscience as the blanket philosophical term for science and technology in the 21st century. And I think that the right way to address that problem is to refuse to accept either of the two possible options, using it or not using it. There are times, like Andy Feenberg says, where it's very important that you think of science by itself, simply in terms of the rigor of its procedures. Never mind that it's a life expression. Never mind that, you know, it's got a whole long history of other ways of being perceived and so on. There are times when you need to understand it simply as in terms of the way it develops internally. And to give you a simple example of it's when you start thinking about the implications of quantum mechanics. Then the challenge it makes to the way we tend to think of the study of the world is really deep and something you can take on all by itself. Never mind that, of course, it also includes and involves the more sophisticated technologies that we have gained so that we can get this view. Okay, but there is a time, in other words, to think of science simply as a practice. Okay, he also does that sometimes because he wants to remind us that the way that we then employ science is not dictated by science itself. The fact that we now know a great deal about neurophysiology doesn't mean that we have to think about thought as if it were neurophysiological, as if that were its real nature. Okay, so there are times when thinking about it separately is important. There are also times when it can be a real danger, as for example, when it tends to make us think of technology only in terms of scientific applications. Okay, the most obvious way in which this is a bad way to think about it is, if there weren't already technologies extant, there wouldn't be any science. This is what we get from people like the historian of medieval science. His last name is White. I can't remember his first name. The historians among us would remember that, but he makes it really clear that, you know, you got to think of all those monks as gadget freaks, and what they produced are the things that then Galileo could use, right? If they weren't already around, then the whole idea of scientific observation would have been a non-starter, unless Galileo were also himself a kind of engineer. Okay, so there are also times when the notion of technology needs to be combined with science, so that, for example, we think of science as technoscience, not as learning how to make plows and hammers in ancient times. There's also another reason to think of it as a single phenomenon, and that is, there's no way anymore in life itself to sharply distinguish scientific practice from technological practice. They are now together the way we understand the world and how we should live in it. And that both will allow you to focus on life in a way that doesn't think of all technology as if it were applied science, and also to think of a way in which it has a kind of essencing about it that our experience is telling us is not always a good thing. It has a kind of impetus to it that pushes us in directions of reductive conceptions of thought, of reductive conceptions of education, and all the rest. Anyway, you see where I'm going with that. I'll cut it off.
Sure, I still think I'm agreeing with you basically, but anyway, thank you. All right, I'll shut up and let David have a say.
David.
Yes, Bob, thank you so much.
Hi, David.
For this paper, which I think I mostly understood, but I have some questions. I'll start out this way. You talked a lot about Descartes.
Yeah.
You know, I used to tell my students when I started teaching Descartes that everybody thinks Descartes is wrong. You can look in yesterday's philosophy journal and find another argument why Descartes is wrong. You know, Damasio, all these things. And sure enough, here we are. Today's lecture tells us again. And what I used to say to my students is, you know, anybody who still has to be refuted 400 years after he wrote must have got something right.
That's the point.
And the question is, what is it? And I found the answer, I think, in part of your lecture when you mentioned the bridge to Portsmouth, the surgeon.
Yeah.
There it is, right? I mean, we have to take that seriously. We have to set aside, so to speak, if we want to get to Portsmouth, or if we want to get the surgery done, you know, we have to admit that. We do it maybe with some regret, but there it is. I mean, it's something we have to. So what does that really mean? For you and for others, maybe me too, what it means is insisting that that is not all there is, right? And here, I found it interesting as well in your paper that you made quite a bit of use of the distinction between explanation and understanding, which is, of course, a long-standing traditional approach to this problem of sort of putting science/technology in its place by insisting that there's something else, that it can't be subsumed under that. Now, I want to get in a remark about the later Heidegger here, because one of the things that's always bothered me about his philosophy of technology, its whole analysis and so forth, is that it seems to me, all that he can come up with by way of alternative is this mysterious one of these days thing called Denken. And he just gives us nothing as far as I can see, except that it's other. Anyway, I'd like to hear your response. These are not questions that all line up in a row. They're all sort of.
No, yeah, okay. I don't know which one to take up first. It's Descartes is still alive in the way that you described, embedded in the way that we think of the applications of science. The tree is still there, the way, you know, he set it up, and structured pretty much the way it was, except Descartes is also alive in another way. And that is not in what he explicitly said, but in the attitude in which he said it. That's what I meant when I said that we inherit Descartes as a Cartesian. That is not in his theories. If it were in his theories, then we could either reject them all, as people tend to do when they say we're over Descartes, we're post-Cartesians, all of us. The French never are, but in a different sense than that, which is that, sure enough, They're going to be subjects talking about objects and theorizing them. That is true even among philosophers of technology like Stiegler, for example, right? Who gives us this enormous laundry list of the things you have to read before you know anything at all about what it's really like to live in the 21st century, okay? And then he tries to apply those. He forms an institute. He gives us directions on what to do about being techno-proletarianized. He goes, in other words, he does exactly the thing that you do when you apply theory to objects. Okay, now that is not the fault of his theories. That is the fault of his thinking of everything we need to know about life and how to live through it in theoretical terms. That's the way in which Descartes really still lives. Okay, and you can get rid of all the theories that have come out of Descartes you want. All the Cartesian theories, all you can recontextualize everything he ever said about anything, any concrete thing, and do it in a Cartesian way. Hilary Putnam used to talk about Rorty this way. Rorty is, you know, his enemy, of course, is even farther back. It's Plato, but he's doing the same sort of thing in exposing this sort of Platonic way in which we think of everything in essential terms. I'm not sure it's in. Yeah, it is. It is in print in Realism in a Human Face with a Human Face. But I actually heard him talk about this. Hilary says that the trouble with Rorty is not so much what he says about the view from nowhere. It's that he says it from a view from nowhere. And I think that's the trouble with a lot of so-called post-Cartesians. They rightly reject all the ways in which Descartes' theories are dated or empirically wrong, or make authoritative conceptual demands on us that aren't deserved. But to reject that is to be Cartesian. It's to take the same willful view that he describes in the fourth meditation and think of oneself as proudly beyond that because one is interested in other topics than the ones Descartes was in another way than objectively. So for me, that's the way, that's what we have to recover in teaching people that Descartes has been thoroughly rejected, but really not. Now, the other thing about Denken and understanding and explanation, one of the ways in which my paper is very sloppy is I didn't have time to distinguish Dilthey and Heidegger on the notion of Verstehen. I am very clear that for Dilthey, that is a method for a science that requires drawing upon our capacity to understand. Okay, but for Heidegger, understanding is not something we do, it's something we are. And it already arrives in us in a historical way, so that everything is sort of pre-understood. That was one of the themes that I was trying to draw out by describing the haunting of contemporary thought by the modern tradition, by the epistemological tradition. Now, once you make the distinction that way, then understanding as a method, explaining as a method, poetizing, loving, existing with this ring, as Heidegger makes that very quick quip in the latter part of Being in Time. These are all different ways of articulating understanding, interpreting in the Being in Time sense. Not yet interpreting according to a method, but just spelling out what you understand, how you understand. Okay, I think that's got to come first. Once that comes, then you can start separating out various, quote, manifestations. Heidegger, the young Heidegger calls these intensifications of life. That is, ways of spelling out, of articulating, of expressing the various concerns that arise in being in the world. And those concerns and the way they arise don't have a method. They can be followed. We can analyze them. We can, as he says, follow along with them without just becoming any one of them. That's what, in fact, hermeneutics is supposed to do. But the number and variety of those expressions doesn't have a set number. From one perspective, I want to say the human sciences understand and the natural sciences explain. From another perspective, I want to say, yeah, but explanation in biology and physics are very different, okay? And that needs to be further specified hermeneutically. Similarly with the human sciences. Sociological understanding and psychological understanding and historical understanding, they're all in a family together, but they're also very different from each other. And where I'm talking from when I say all of that is from the idea that understanding is something we are, and then we can do in various ways by interpreting.
Well, let me just throw in a couple of remarks here that may clarify that. Dilthey said that we are historical beings before we become observers of history, and only because we're the former can we become the latter. I mean, so that's really relevant.
Right.
And the other thing, of course, is to remember that what you say about method, why did Gadamer call his book Truth and Method? It was very ironic. His whole point in a way that there isn't any method for understanding.
That's right. That's exactly right. No, that's exactly right. In fact, that's what I'll stop there. That's exactly right. The young Heidegger has a long piece in which he criticizes Husserl on exactly this issue. There is no method for phenomenology. It resides only in its results. It proves itself by its results. Okay, so Husserl is in one respect dead right. Epistemology is a methodological problem from the get-go for a phenomenologist. It's the most serious problem they face. But it's a problem because we have to convince a whole tradition that there is no method for doing phenomenology, right? That's precisely what makes it phenomenological, is not having a method. Yeah.
Not sure I agree with that, but
I know. How could you? Not unless you want to. Never mind.
If no one else has any questions, I might dip my toe in again and just ask about the. You mentioned in your paper about the predictive power, I suppose, of staying in Dilthey. I think that's something that Heidegger wouldn't agree with, purely because history isn't being historical is not being able to predict the future based off the historical conditions of the past. I'm not saying you were saying that on the historical conditions of the past, but almost being prepared to anticipate events as they come, I suppose. But the predictive quality or the predictive power of being historical has been an essential component of history since I suppose the ancients. You know, we see classical scholarship now where they point back to Polybius defining. Well, people ask of Polybius, how are we able to predict history based on what you've written about these conditions? And you see this all the way up until Hempel, where you've got this bizarre notion that if you can understand the exact conditions that facilitated any historical event as it occurred, then we can predict similar events. And I think
covering laws, right?
Sure, and I think this has come back slightly now in the philosophy of scientific historiography as well in the last 10 years. But I just wonder then, could you expand on Dilthey's notion of the predictive power of Verstehen? How is that different?
One of the ways to get Dilthey wrong is to think that he thinks that the natural sciences explain and the human sciences only understand and interpret. Okay, he's perfectly willing to grant that any phenomenon we can develop explanations about. Okay, you can have a causal account of history if you treat history as an object, where you then try to explain the connection between events that you describe, with one proviso, and that is if you want to understand those causes, you have to remember that historians have to reverse their order, right? You don't look at them just, they'll say that this followed, we know that this followed that, right? You have to go back and try to understand how it could have followed, even if you're thinking causally, right? All right, now, so it's true that historians, like most human scientists, tend to emphasize another kind of research project, but it is not true that you can't explain history. But the catch is, when you do that, you, as Dilthey puts it, go back behind the living through life and posit a theory about what that previous life has been. That's how you get a historian's idea of what history is, right? Now, if you don't do that, if instead you try to understand a period or a person or a set of activities or the production of the Parthenon, or, in its own terms, you deliberately try not to introduce the development of the thing that you're describing by first going back behind it and saying what it really must manifest, like Greek art or or psychological pathology, or, right? The minute you do that, then all you've got is an explanation in terms of the theoretical implications that you have put there in place in the first place, so you can reconstruct it and find implications. Then you get predictions. In some cases, good predictions. And maybe it's like it was in the 19th century. We're doing that right now with respect to Watergate and Trump, right? Okay, I think that's very healthy. Go on, let 1,000 flowers bloom. But there is also another way to understand historical events, which gives you not predictions, but at best projections. And that's what I think both Heidegger and Kant had. And I think also you can find, if you read any philosopher on any topic, you can find that. For example, Natorp was predicting something like a phenomenology of scientific reasoning by insisting that it was not enough to give an account of knowing. You had to give some kind of an account, even though it can't be conceptual. You have to give some kind of account of how we come to know. He called it subjective reconstruction. And Heidegger, of course, jumps all over it by saying, well, if you can make it sensible, then you're no longer a Kantian, right? So you're this peculiar thing, this subjective reconstruction. This is bullshit. This is, it's out of minute. But he then follows it up by saying, yeah, but why would he do something so stupid? Why would he violate the Kantian principles so obviously that way? He knows perfectly well what the criticism of that is. His other neo-Kantians want to drum him out of the profession, right? The reason he does that is because he already has a phenomenological insight. He comes from life in a way he doesn't know how to expect properly. Okay, so I would say, to the extent that one lives through one's experience with some sense of where it all is going, it's not predictive, but it's projective.
Sure.
Okay. By the way, it's something I forgot when I was replying to Larry. Somewhere in the Black Notebooks, Heidegger has another word for historizing. He calls it futurizing, right? Taking the future as something that could be more than just more of the same under present conditions. And the clues for doing that lie in present experiencing and its lack of fit with the way we've inherited.
I'll have to check that reference. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thing.
Hi, thanks for taking my and for paper today. Sort of unsophisticated question compared to the others, but I wanted
I'll be the judge of that.
I wanted to ask you about narrative in hermeneutic phenomenology. And if we understand encounter with narrative as something like an encounter of a telling of actual or possible historical experience, maybe as an account of the path one has taken or might have taken to arrive in the present as having been, how does an encounter with narrative give rise to a resonance with our own historical concerns?
I'm not sure I've got a good answer to this, but there are a couple of things that seem to me involved, and that is what I just did with Natorp and Heidegger is a kind of narrative, right? My point was not to let people get away with saying how stupid Natorp was for trying to find something that his own principles as a Kantian disallow, okay? Or to say, ah, yes, you see, as a Kantian, this all full of shit yet, but now he also did something new. What he called a subjective reconstruction, we can now call phenomenology, right? You need a quote narrative account of how you get from one to the other. And Heidegger does this in in his early language he calls a destructive retrieval. You try to get Natorp out of his own way by emphasizing what he was getting at, but lacked the conceptual tools to get at in an appropriately phenomenological way. This is not a subjective reconstruction. It's only called subjective because you've already prioritized the objective and made the two of them the whole thing, right? Okay, no, what you got to see is that before there are objects and subjects, before there's an outside and an inside, okay, there is the living through of life in such a way that we sometimes distinguish an outside and an inside for purposes that respond to our concerns. But here's a case where we should not do that, because if we do that, then we will not see how ideas move in life in such a way that the way we express them may or may not be adequate to what they are. Narrative comes closer. Objective account does not. Am I responding to what you're asking?
Absolutely, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we've sadly come to the end of the session now. So if I could thank Robert again for an amazing
Enjoyed it. Thanks for coming.
Presentation. Thank you everyone for the discussion as well. And I look forward to seeing everyone next week.